The park was teeming with life on a sunny Fort Collins, Colorado afternoon. Children played happily, joggers kept the pace steady along the paths, and families picnicked under the shade of tall oak trees. In the midst of this vibrant and peaceful setting, Camille, a highly respected black lawyer, enjoyed a rare moment of rest. Sitting on a bench by the lake, she was immersed in reading a thick hardcover book, seeking some relief from her busy routine. Suddenly, a sharp squeal of tires tore through the air, breaking the serenity of the moment. A police car stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, drawing the attention of the curious people around. Two police officers got out of the vehicle, with stern expressions and a posture that exuded authority. His gaze immediately fixed on Camille, the only lonely black person in that area of the park. "Madame, can we talk to you for a moment?" one of the officers called, his voice charged with suspicion rather than concern. Camille looked up from the book, keeping a calm, unwavering expression. "Of course," she replied, closing the book carefully and trying to ignore the weight of the officer's critical eye. "We received a complaint about suspicious activity in the area. Can you tell us what you're doing here?" said the second officer, his tone sharp, insinuating that something was wrong. Camille arched an eyebrow, visibly intrigued by the absurd accusation. "Suspicious activity? I'm just sitting here reading," she replied, raising the book to reinforce her statement. The police, however, did not seem convinced. "Can we see an ID?" demanded the first officer. Camille felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained serene. "I don't understand what the reason for this is," she said, keeping her calm despite the situation becoming increasingly hostile. "That's routine," replied the second officer, though his tone clearly suggested otherwise. A small crowd began to gather, watching the scene with curiosity and discomfort. Some whispered to each other, while others exchanged apprehensive looks. Noticing the imbalance in the interaction, Camille sighed, took her wallet from her purse, and handed her driver's license to the officers. They examined her with unnecessary intensity. "Camille Johnson," the officer read aloud, almost dismissively. "What are you doing here, Miss Helena Johnson?" "I came to the park to enjoy the day." "Is that a problem?" asked Camille, trying to maintain a friendly tone but increasingly aware of the hostility she faced. The policemen's hands were already clenched, the air around them becoming tense and charged with distrust. "Let's see," said one of them, returning the document. But instead of leaving, they continued around her, asking questions that seemed less routine and more like an interrogation. "Do you always carry a book like this?" one of the officers scoffed. "Are you alone here or waiting for someone?" the other teased, his hand resting deliberately on his belt, a gesture Camille recognized as a warning. Camille, who had previously dealt with tense situations in courts, realized that the situation was not just about police curiosity. It was an obvious abuse of power. He took a deep breath and chose his words carefully. "I'm not going to answer any more questions unless they tell me what I'm being accused of." His refusal seemed to trigger something in the officers. The first officer stepped forward, increasing the intimidation. "Are you resisting?" he snapped, even though Camille had done nothing but demand clarity. "What are you doing?" exclaimed Camille, her voice wavering between surprise and indignation. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, and a man began recording the scene with his cell phone. "It's resisting," the policeman repeated, this time more aggressively. Before she could react, Camille felt the metallic cold of the handcuffs squeezing her wrists. Humiliation and frustration burned in her chest as she was led toward the patrol car, ignoring her legitimate questions. The crowd watched, some in shock, others filming, trying to understand how a simple reading in a park had turned into such an unjust arrest. But for Camille, that wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The night after Camille's arrest was cold and sweltering. After being subjected to humiliating treatment at the police station, being fingerprinted, photographed and locked in a tiny cell and lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly, she was finally released on bail. As he left the station, the frigid night air seemed even more biting, like a cruel reminder of the injustice he had just faced. Outside, Her friend and colleague, Marisa, waited anxiously. Marissa's face was a mixture of relief and concern, reflecting the horror she had felt when she heard about Camille's arrest. "Are you okay?" asked Marisa, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Camille replied, trying to sound strong, but fatigue and frustration weighed on her words. As Marisa drove back home, Camille remained silent, her gaze lost in the darkness of the road, but his mind was far from quiet. She repeated the events in the park over and over again, trying to find logic in a completely absurd situation. But there was no logic, only pure and bitter prejudice. That night, in her kitchen, surrounded by notepads and open books, Camille began outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers in the department. His hands trembled as he wrote, "Not out of fear, but out of fierce determination." She knew she couldn't let it go. He had knowledge, tools, and a powerful voice, and she would use them all. However, Camille had no idea that as she prepared for her personal battle, something much bigger was already happening. The video recorded by a man in the park had been shared on social media, spreading like wildfire. The images clearly showed Camille being approached aggressively by police officers without any justification, followed by the exaggerated use of handcuffs to arrest her. The video quickly went viral. The title, "Black Woman is Arrested While Reading a Book in the Park," ignited discussions about racism, abuse of power, and the unequal way Black people are treated by authorities. Commentators, activists, and ordinary people came together to express their outrage and share their own experiences with discrimination and abuse. With each new share, Camille's story reached more and more people. The support was overwhelming. Messages of encouragement poured in from all corners of the country, and even from outside the country. People from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and histories came together in solidarity, acknowledging injustice and calling for accountability. Camille, who was not active on social media, was surprised to discover the impact her case was having. Marisa constantly updated her on posts, comments, and messages of support. Camille began to receive emails, phone calls, and even visits from people who wanted to show solidarity and help in some way. But they were not just words of support. There was action. Civil rights lawyers, activists, and journalists offered their platforms and services to ensure that the truth was heard and justice was served. Articles were written, interviews were requested, and Camille Johnson's name became synonymous with resistance against the abuse of power. The viralization of the video not only strengthened Camille's resolve, it also provided the necessary impetus for her to continue fighting. It was no longer a personal matter. His case had become a symbol of something much bigger. It was about justice, dignity, and responsibility. Now, with an invisible army of supporters on her side, Camille felt she had renewed strength to stand up to the system that had failed her. But the real challenge was yet to come, and she was determined to face it head-on. After the initial shock of her arrest and the overwhelming impact of the video going viral, Camille knew she needed to act. But this time, she would not act like the lawyer who has always been on the other side of the table, defending clients who are victims of injustice. Now, she herself was the victim and the protagonist of a battle that crossed the boundaries of her own history. That night, in her small kitchen transformed into a true strategic center, Camille surrounded herself with legal books, notebooks, and documents open everywhere. His laptop gleamed on the desk, where row upon row of detailed notes took shape. Her hands moved fast, writing and researching, even when they trembled from the intensity of the moment. Her physical exhaustion was clear, but her determination kept her steady. She clearly remembered the officer's tone of voice, the disdainful questions asked, and the pain of the handcuffs pressing against her skin. But more than that, he remembered the look on the eyes of the people in the park, some curious, some incredulous, but all aware that what had happened was a terrible mistake. Camille began by outlining her legal strategy with surgical precision. The charge of resisting arrest was absurd and easily dismantled by the available evidence. The video, which had gone viral, clearly showed that she offered no resistance. In addition, She had decided to file a civil rights lawsuit against the police officers and the department responsible, alleging racial discrimination, abuse of power, and unlawful imprisonment. Her years of experience as an attorney allowed her to structure the case impeccably. Every detail was considered: legal precedents, police regulations, testimony from witnesses who were in the park that day, and of course, the video that was now his greatest asset. Camille also began compiling a detailed report on her arrest, describing the experience step by step and attaching every detail that could bolster her case. But Camille knew that in order to stand up to a system built to protect those who abuse it, she would need support. So he turned to colleagues and friends who were lawyers he trusted, people who shared not only his passion for justice, but also an understanding of how the system could be twisted against the most vulnerable. Marisa, his friend and colleague, became his greatest ally, always present, helping to organize documents, schedule meetings, and coordinate contacts with other lawyers and activists. While Camille prepared her legal strategy, Marisa was in charge of connecting her story to other voices facing similar struggles. The days turned into weeks. Camille continued to work tirelessly, balancing her quest for justice with her professional responsibilities. But it was clear that his legal battle had become his top priority. As the construction of the case progressed, the community around him strengthened. People who had been through similar situations began to speak out, sharing their own stories of injustice. This growing network of support was a constant reminder that their struggle wasn't just personal, it was part of a much larger movement. But Camille's preparation was not restricted to the judicial process. She also made a point of getting involved with the local community. He attended public meetings, listened carefully to the stories of others who had faced discrimination, and even lectured on responsibility and civil rights at local universities. Her mission was not only to ensure justice for herself, but also to open avenues for others to find their own voices. Each new story Camille heard fueled her determination. Each story reinforced his conviction that his struggle was just and necessary. The battle she had decided to face was not just against two specific police officers, but against an entire system that allowed these situations to continue to occur. His preparation was meticulous. Camille reviewed similar cases, looked for precedents, and gathered evidence that could completely dismantle the officers' arguments. But she also knew that, as sound as her strategy was, true justice would not be achieved only within the courts. She needed to change hearts and minds. And so, while the world continued to follow her story through social media and news, Camille remained steadfast. What had started as a simple moment of reading in a park had grown into a much larger cause. A cause she would not abandon, regardless of the obstacles she might face. Camille's tireless work was finally taking shape. His legal team had built a strong case based on irrefutable evidence and backed by a collective support that was growing stronger by the day. But in the middle of the preparation, an unexpected twist caused everything to change drastically. On an ordinary morning, Camille's phone rang. On the other end of the line, his lawyer sounded worried and cautious. "Camille, we have a problem. Or maybe an opportunity. It depends on how you look at it," he said, with a hesitation he never used to show. She listened intently as he explained that the officers responsible for her arrest, identified as Carter and Daniels, had been formally charged with misconduct in a case unrelated to hers, this time for excessive use of force against a young black man during a routine traffic stop. The images of unnecessary brutality were revealed, and public pressure to hold them accountable had grown significantly. But the real surprise came when the lawyer revealed that the judge assigned to hear the case of police officers, Carter and Daniels, had resigned due to health problems, and the court had assigned the case to none other than Camille Johnson. She would be the judge responsible for deciding the fate of the men who had humiliated and unjustly imprisoned her weeks earlier. Camille was paralyzed for a moment. It was as if fate was cruelly playing with her, putting her exactly where she needed to be, but in a way she would never have expected. The irony was overwhelming. and at the same time an unparalleled opportunity to demonstrate what true justice meant. During the weeks leading up to the trial, Camille prepared herself mentally and emotionally. She knew that her role would require absolute impartiality. Even if these men were responsible for an injustice against her, her responsibility as a judge was to ensure a fair and ethical trial. But that didn't mean she would let her crimes go unpunished. The day of judgment has come. The courtroom was full. Soft murmurs filled the air as Camille walked in dressed in her black toga. She walked with purpose and dignity, her expression calm but authoritative. As he sat on the bench, his eyes were fixed on the defendants, Carter and Daniels. Carter's face turned pale as soon as he recognized Camille. His wide eyes displayed shock and fear. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, clenching his jaw as he tried to process what he saw. It was clear that they did not expect that the woman they had humiliated weeks earlier would be the judge who would decide their future. The trial began, and Camille maintained her professional and rigorous posture. The defendants' lawyers presented their defenses, trying to justify the excessive use of force as a necessary decision in the face of a critical situation. But the arguments were fragile, and Camille knew it. She followed every word said, taking notes with surgical attention and keeping her expression serious and impartial. During the testimonies, it was possible to see that the police officers were struggling internally. Carter often looked away when Camille addressed him. His tense body and trembling voice indicated that perhaps he was beginning to understand the weight of his actions. At halftime, Camille watched them in the hallway. The two policemen spoke in low voices, worried, unsure. "How is she the judge? This must be some kind of montage," said Carter, his voice charged with frustration and fear. Daniels shook his head, clearly confused and disoriented. Their lawyer tried to defuse the situation by reminding them that they should stay focused and respond only with the truth. Back in the courtroom, Camille continued to listen to testimony and analyze the details of the case. Her professionalism was unquestionable, and her imposing presence made the officers move uncomfortably with every word she uttered. Every question, every remark of hers seemed to disarm them, exposing the flaws in her justifications. The trial dragged on for hours, but Camille showed no signs of fatigue. He kept his gaze fixed, his thoughts organized and his words measured. He knew that his duty was not to seek revenge, but to ensure that justice prevailed. When the day finally came to an end, Camille ended the session with a firm blow of the hammer. "We will meet again tomorrow at 9 a.m., he announced authoritatively. The officers left the room in silence, their grim expressions demonstrating that, for the first time, they felt the real weight of the consequences of their actions. Camille sat for a moment, her eyes fixed on the notes she had taken. She knew that the real challenge was not only in the irony of that trial, but in how she would choose to act in the face of such a unique opportunity. An opportunity to show the world what true justice meant. The days following the start of the Aguis trial were intense. The courtroom continued to be full at each session, with journalists and spectators eager to follow the developments of the case. Camille's words at the end of each hearing were repeated incessantly in the media. "This court is now a place where truth will be heard and justice will be done." The case against police officers Carter and Daniels was moving forward meticulously. The prosecution presented its evidence accurately, highlighting the troubling pattern of behavior by officers who repeatedly acted with excessive and unnecessary force. The accusation was clear: abuse of power, lack of responsibility, and violation of the civil rights of citizens. One of the most important pieces of the process was the testimony of Ian, the young black man who had been brutally treated by officers during a seemingly routine traffic stop. Ian sat on the witness stand with visible nervousness, but his voice, though trembling, was firm. He recounted how the officers had knocked him to the ground without any reasonable justification, treating him as if he were a threat simply because he existed. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Ian said, his eyes moving nervously between the lawyers and the police officers who watched him with blank expressions. "They decided I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." Ian's words caused A murmur in the courtroom. Camille remained attentive, recording every detail. When the defense attorney tried to discredit the testimony by insinuating that Ian had resisted arrest, the young man replied clearly, "I was scared, but I did everything I was asked. They didn't care. They had already decided what I was for." Then Camille observed the young man with empathy and professionalism. Her story was a disturbing mirror of what she herself had faced. The difference was that now, Camille had the power to ensure that the truth was heard. When it came time for the officers to testify, their words were less secure. Officer Carter was the first to step into the pulpit. His stiff posture and trembling voice were clear signs that the weight of his actions was finally beginning to manifest itself. I thought the situation was escalating," Carter said, looking away from Camille as she spoke. "I acted in the heat of the moment. I thought I was doing what was necessary." "What would you do differently if you could?" asked the prosecutor, pressuring him to acknowledge his mistakes. I should have listened. It didn't have to be that way," Carter replied, now in a tone that seemed to suggest genuine repentance. Officer Daniels was next. Unlike Carter, he was defensive, denying any real responsibility for his actions. His tone was cold, trying to justify the unjustifiable. Camille watched intently, noticing how Daniels's lack of genuine repentance contrasted with Carter's apparent reflection. The last day of the trial arrived. The closing arguments were presented with intensity and clarity. The prosecutor pointed out that the officers had ignored fundamental protocols that were supposed to protect the community and not intimidate it. Carter and Daniels had abused their power and violated the public trust. The defense lawyer, although hardworking, seemed unable to offer convincing justifications for the acts of the police. His voice sounded desperate, almost half-hearted. Even the defendants themselves seemed to realize that the result would not be favorable to them. When the final words were pronounced, the court sank into a deep silence. Everyone was anxiously waiting for the decision that would come the following week. The pressure on Camille was enormous, but she stood her ground. Her duty as a judge was to ensure that the truth prevailed. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, and the air was thick with anticipation. Camille, in her black toga, entered the room with the same calm and dignified composure she had maintained throughout the trial. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those who have this responsibility abuse their power, they erode public trust and cause damage that goes beyond the immediate victim, Camille said, her firm voice echoing through the room. Based on the evidence presented and the testimony collected, this court concludes that Officers Carter and Daniels acted recklessly and unnecessarily, ignoring protocols and acting with excessive force. As a result, both are held accountable for their actions and will face the consequences. The final decision included mandatory suspension without pay, participation in extensive re-education and professional re-evaluation programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would accompany them permanently. Camille had chosen an approach that not only punished but also required learning and change. Before leaving the courtroom, Carter approached timidly. "Your Lordship," he said, his voice low and trembling, "I just wanted to apologize for what happened to you and for what I did to that kid." Camille stared at him for a moment. His gaze was steady but without hatred. "True change comes not from words but from actions. I hope you take it seriously." Carter nodded slowly before walking away, while Daniels left the courtroom without turning around, still carrying the fragile armor of denial. For Camille, that was not the end. It was just a beginning. His decision had set an important precedent, but the real battle for justice and systemic accountability had yet to be fought. The impact of Camille's trial was immediate and overwhelming. News of the decision spread quickly, driven by journalists, activists, and social media users who followed every detail of the case. But more important than the media coverage was the palpable effect his courageous stand was beginning to have on the community and beyond. Camille did not settle for the court's victory. He knew that holding 2 police officers accountable for their actions was only the first step. Real change required broader reform, an ongoing effort to transform the system and ensure that justice was accessible to all, regardless of their color, class, or background. A few days after the verdict, Camille attended a community meeting at a local recreation center. The room was packed. People of all ages and backgrounds had gathered to discuss the impact of the trial and the actions that should be taken from then on. Community leaders, activists, and even some public officials were present. Camille took a discreet place in the back of the room, wanting to hear more than talk. He knew that his role, while important, was only one part of something much bigger. As she listened to people share their own painful experiences of discrimination, abuse, and neglect by the authorities, Camille felt a deep sense of purpose. His fight couldn't just be about his own case. It was about all those who faced injustice on a daily basis, often without a voice to defend themselves. And this is the most important point. Compassion and kindness are powerful weapons to confront the injustices of the world. It is not just about fighting against what is wrong, but about building something better, something more just and humane. Every act of empathy, every gesture of understanding, and every voice that rises up to stand up for what's right makes a difference. Camille also shows us that even when we face hardship and injustice, we shouldn't let hatred and bitterness guide our steps. Instead, we must allow love for others and the will to build a better world to inspire our actions. If you believe that it is possible to make a difference and that everyone deserves to be treated with fairness and respect, share this message. Let's continue to raise our voices and promote compassion as a genuine force for change. And before you go, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next stories and reflections. Your participation is essential for us to continue spreading this message of justice, kindness, and transformation. Together, we can create a better world. See you next time.